Welcome back, everyone, to Research Review Radio. We have a really fascinating deep dive planned for today, all about death.
Yeah, it is a pretty universal topic, isn't it?
It is. We all experience it, but we're looking at it through a specific cultural lens this time, the rituals of Hinduism.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Should be a good one.
We're going way beyond just like the biological,
Yeah.
the science of it.
Right.
And really exploring how certain practices can offer some really interesting insights into grief and loss.
And letting go. That's a big one, right?
Exactly. Letting go. That's a big part of it. And that's something that our source material today really dives into.
Oh, okay, cool. So what are we looking at today?
We're looking at this incredibly powerful article by Ketika Garg.
Okay.
She's a PhD student of cognitive science at the University of California. And what makes her perspective so unique is that she kind of blends her own personal experience of losing her mother with her, scholarly understanding of these rituals.
Wow, that is a really interesting perspective. I'm curious to hear how those two things weave together.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so compelling. It's not just an academic analysis. It's really grounded in her lived experience.
Sure.
So
Right.
she really turned to those Hindu rituals, to find comfort and to try to understand what she was going through. And it made me think a lot about how these practices can offer a framework for processing something so huge.
Yeah, rituals have a way of grounding us, don't they? Especially when we're dealing with those big existential questions. Okay, so let's dig into this a bit. What were some of those rituals that she found comfort in?
Well, she talks about how these rituals were passed down for generations in her family. And
Okay.
there's this concept in Hinduism that's really central to understanding death. This idea of body and soul.
Right. The idea that the soul is immortal, separate from the body, which is just a temporary home, right?
Exactly. So it's not just about the physical death, but about the soul's journey afterwards.
And that belief, I imagine, really shapes how Hindus approach death itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
And this is where the practice of cremation comes in,
Okay.
which is seen as a final sacrifice. It's like liberating the soul from the body. And there are some specific rituals involved. Some of them, I have to admit, when I first read about them, I was like, whoa.
Oh, yeah, I bet. Like what kind of rituals?
Okay, well, have you ever heard of, striking the skull?
Striking the skull? No, I haven't.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty intense.
Right. When I read that, I was like, okay, this is pretty intense.
Wow. So what's the meaning behind that?
Well, Ketika explores this, both from her own experience and, academically. And for Hindus, it's not meant to be disrespectful at all.
Okay.
Instead, it symbolizes breaking that attachment to the physical form so the soul can move on. And after that, the ashes are scattered, often in a sacred river like the Ganges, which symbolizes the soul's journey continuing.
So the rituals are almost like physically acting out those beliefs, making them real.
Yes, like bringing those abstract ideas about the soul to life.
I love that. It's like they're giving form to something that's so hard to grasp, like the afterlife. It makes you wonder if rituals across cultures serve a similar purpose, helping us understand difficult concepts in a more tangible way.
It's a great point.
Yeah.
Think about doorways, like how we use doorways to symbolize transitions.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like walking through a doorway to mark a new beginning, like getting married. You're literally stepping into a new phase of life.
Exactly. You're physically enacting the change, making it real.
Mm.
So in a similar way, you have the cremation ceremony and the scattering of the ashes.
All right. And that act is enacting that detachment from the physical body. It's not just symbolic. It's like a lived experience of that concept.
And it makes me appreciate Ketika's background in cognitive science because she brings that lens to this whole exploration.
Right. So she's not just looking at it from a spiritual perspective, but also how these rituals actually affect our thinking and our understanding. It's like she's bridging those two worlds.
Exactly. There's this beautiful quote from the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu scripture. It is not born. It does not die. It is not killed when the body is killed.
Wow. That's powerful. It really challenges how we usually think about death. It's not an ending, but a continuation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it offers comfort. Even if you don't subscribe to Hindu beliefs, just that idea of the soul living on, or maybe consciousness transforming. It's something to think about, isn't it?
It definitely makes you rethink things. And it really ties back to the rituals we've been discussing. The cremation, the scattering of ash, it's all an expression of that belief in the soul's continued journey. It's like they're saying, look, the body may be gone, but the essence of who we are lives on.
Mm.
And that's a really powerful message, no matter what your background is.
It really makes you think about how different cultures have come up with totally different ways of dealing with death.
I think that's one of the most fascinating things about studying rituals. Like, they offer these windows into how different cultures grapple with those big universal experiences, like loss and grief.
Right. And it challenges your own assumptions too, doesn't it? Like, it forces you to step outside your own comfort zone and consider these really different ways of thinking about it.
Exactly. It's like, okay, this is how this culture makes sense of it. And it opens up your mind to all these possibilities, right? Okay, so getting back to Ketika Garg's article, what I found really interesting was how she wove her background in cognitive science into all of this.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, that's where it gets really, really insightful. She talks about how rituals are kind of like this bridge between those abstract ideas and our actual lived experiences. You know what I mean?
Right. Like, she's making those ideas more concrete, more relatable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, earlier when we were talking about doorways as symbols of transitions, I was thinking just by physically walking through a doorway, you're kind of acting out that idea of moving from one state to another, aren't you?
Oh, totally. You're making it real in a way. And I think that's what Ketika is getting at with these Hindu rituals. Like, the cremation, the scattering of ashes, those aren't just symbolic actions, right? They're like embodiments of those concepts of detachment and letting go.
So it's not just about going through the motions, but about the cognitive process that they trigger.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually helping us internalize those really complicated ideas and emotions.
Exactly. The rituals, they provide like a structure, a framework for making sense of something that's so huge and often just really overwhelming, like death. It's like they offer a path through grief. They help us navigate that emotional landscape.
And what's so interesting is how those paths can be so different depending on the culture. Like, some cultures really emphasize remembrance, celebrating the person's life. And then others, like Hinduism, really focus on that idea of the soul's journey and letting go of attachment.
It's incredible, isn't it? Like, it really shows the ingenuity of humans, how we've come up with all these different responses to these shared human experiences. And exploring those variations can be so valuable, I think, for just broadening our own understanding of grief and how we cope with it.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that there's no one right way to grieve. Each culture has its own wisdom and practices for how to navigate this universal experience.
That's such an important point. Whether we find solace in these ancient rituals or we create our own ways of honoring the people we've lost, that journey of grief is something we all go through at some point in our lives.
It's a reminder of our shared humanity, I think, and just how important it is to have empathy and understanding across cultures, especially when we're talking about something as sensitive and personal as death.
Absolutely. And what I think Ketika Garg's article shows us so beautifully is that even in the midst of this huge personal loss, there's also this opportunity for really profound learning and growth.
Right. Like, her story highlights how powerful ritual can be. And it reminds us of the importance of understanding different cultures. And ultimately, it shows the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of death.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to see how she was able to draw strength and understanding from these ancient traditions and to connect them to her own journey, both personally and academically.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive into Hindu death rituals and the way they can help us understand these concepts, cognitively, it's important to remember that this is just one perspective.
Right.
It's one way of looking at this incredibly complex and multifaceted topic. This has been so fascinating. I mean, we've really gone from these ancient traditions to talking about consciousness and how we think about death, like how our minds process it.
It's amazing what Ketika Garg's story has opened up, like through her background with cognitive science, we can appreciate how these rituals are about more than just faith, right? They give our brains a way to deal with loss.
Yeah. And I have to admit, some of the rituals, like, I keep thinking about striking the skull during the cremation. That really, at first it was like, whoa, that's a little intense.
I think that's totally understandable for anyone who's, coming at this tradition without that background. But what's so important is to understand the meaning behind it. It's not about disrespect. Not at all.
Right.
It's about letting go of that physical body and recognizing that the soul is moving on.
It really shows how important it is to consider the culture behind these things.
Right.
You can't just look at these rituals without understanding the symbolism and the beliefs that give them their meaning.
Absolutely. It's like learning a new language. You can't just translate words word for word. You have to know the nuances and the culture behind it to really get what's being said.
It's like we're opening a door to a totally new way of thinking about life and death, isn't it?
And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding, right? It's not just about the rituals themselves, but about seeing the world through different lenses. And in the process, expanding our own understanding.
I think that's what Ketika Garg's article really illustrates so well. Even when someone is experiencing such a profound loss, there's this amazing opportunity for growth.
Her story shows how strong the human spirit is, how we can find meaning even when facing death. And it reminds us there are so many ways to heal and to honor the people we've lost.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hindu death rituals and, the power of tradition, we wanted to leave you with something to think about.
How do the rituals and beliefs of your own culture, or maybe a culture you're interested in, how do those address death and grief and letting go?
It's a question worth thinking about. Maybe it'll spark your own deep dive into the amazing tapestry of human experience.